Hello, hello, hello. Nice view from up here. How are we all doing today? You know, we could just make this really short. The future of local radio, it's in the room. But we may have to do a little bit more work than that. Let's think about what we want to achieve out of this session. We've heard a lot about the BBC. This is not an exclusively about the BBC session. We've got some great models of local radio and community-orientated radio to discuss as we examine what the future looks like for local radio. We're coming hot on the heels of Local Radio Day, and one of the testaments that local radio is of such huge interest, what we in the charitable sector would call the evidence of need, is that over 3.5 million people were reached during Local Radio Day last Friday. That was 120 stations fully participating. So the landscape is looking very changing, but it is a full one. And here we are in the city of birth of local radio, but I think one thing we can assume that no particular network has a monopoly on the term local radio. And as there are changes in the sectors of local radio going right across the board and going back many, many years now, we see interesting skills migrations going into other sectors, and that will have an impact. And have we got our fourth guest today yet? There we are. So, welcome. Welcome to the panel. Keri Jones is well known, certainly in the southwest here, with your career, and which has largely been biased towards Wales and the southwest. Currently, of course, residing in Shaftesbury, and has produced, I think, a very innovative model of local radio with a kind of podcast-type offer, which we'll drill down into in a second. That's Alfred. And Miriam James is joining us from Devonstream. In fact, you kind of cross-pollinate around the sectors a little bit. Obviously, you're involved with X as well. I'm really interested in the idea of how various forms of arts in a locality get onto a platform which is, you know, behind Devonstream. So we'll get to that. Chris Burns. Morning, Chris. Joining us. Where are you joining us from?
I'm in Dorking at the moment.
Dorking.
I'm on leave this week, which is why I'm not with you today.
Excellent. Well, good to have your company. Thank you to all the guests for giving up their Saturday to come and help us ponder the mysteries of the future of local radio. Chris, I did try and memorize your title. I'm afraid I really failed. Could you explain what your role is?
Sure. So my name's Chris Burns. I'm controller for local audio, which means that I look after the strategy for local radio across BBC England. It's my responsibility working with Rodri, who's the Director of Nations, and Jason Horton, who's the Director of Production, to come up with a strategy that meets the needs of audiences across the piece. And I didn't hear the whole of David's session previously or some of the questions. But I think one of the things I'd like to start off and just put out there is that I believe passionately in the importance of local radio. And I also completely get the emotional connection that people have with radio. You know, I am of that generation of somebody who grew up with a radio, it was a radio in the kitchen. And there was always a radio in the bedroom. And I'm one of those people that used to kind of steal the radio in the bedroom and, you know, listen to the Radio Luxembourg, all that kind of stuff under my covers. And I was a relatively solitary child. And the radio was one of the ways that I made friends with people. It provided me with companionship. And I was reading a book this morning. It wasn't deliberately, I just happened to be awake. And it's the 100 broadcasting years of the BBC. And one of the things it talked about was when the radio first started, how it kind of introduced people to a whole group of friends. And the reason why I'm making that point is I think when you introduce any changes to any radio station, and I was working at Radio 4 when James Boyle introduced some of the big changes at Radio 4, long time ago now, but everybody felt it very keenly because the radio was the soundtrack to people's lives. So it was almost as if somebody had come in to their living room and they'd moved the furniture around. And I do understand that. So I want to try and put across this afternoon that I understand how keenly people feel about the changes that we've announced across BBC Local. And also to sort of say that the changes we've announced in BBC Local, they are the biggest changes we've seen for a long time, almost since 1967, when Radio Leicester first started broadcasting. They are seismic. And we're doing them not because we dislike local radio. I love local radio, and if you cut me in half, you will find radio is there running through my veins. But the reason we're doing it is we have to recognise that the way in which audiences are consuming audio has changed over the years. If I look at the initiative Make a Difference, which we launched on BBC Local Radio 24 hours after the first lockdown was declared, I think, Make a Difference for me is one of those absolute musts of local radio. It puts those in need of help with those able to offer help. And we now have, for the last couple of years, we've run something called the Make a Difference Awards. And if I look at the nominations for the awards, 52% of those nominations come via social media, not via the radio station. So it's important that we make ourselves seen on those platforms where new audiences are, so we maintain our relevance. We also have to acknowledge, and you've said it yourself, Dom, in your introduction, that we are in a very different media landscape to the one we were in 1967, when the BBC had much more of a monopoly. We have got community radio there now. We have got small commercial radio stations. There are many more people providing services in the local market.
Okay, Chris.
Just let me finish. What we're trying to do in BBC Local is make sure that, yes, we are still there. We will still have 39 bases, but also we will make sure our content is there where people are also consuming BBC services. So that means online. That does mean on sounds, because I believe it's important that if you pay a license fee, you see yourself and where you live reflected back at you, whatever platform you consume a BBC service on.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Now, very glad that you've had a little moment there to explain some things, and some of what you've touched on we will no doubt return to as this session matures. I'm very keen to kind of identify some, particularly, by the way, some of your social value points. To my mind, one of the points of local radio, as opposed to different networks of radio, or one of the points really is what value does it bring to participating individuals? What value is it bringing to community life? And so, Keri, this is something I think you've been thinking about. A very interesting idea that you've come up with, whereby you've got the traditional community radio license in Shaftesbury, but you haven't delivered the traditional community radio model, such as Summer Valley FM, which is just up the road from you. Tell us a little bit about your thinking in how you ended up with more of the kind of podcast approach.
Well, we tried to do something different. I mean, this is what I don't understand about this wanton destruction of BBC Local Radio, because the BBC should be there to innovate and look at technology. And it's true what Chris says about people are living their lives differently, but we tried to look at a model that embraced social media, that looked at how people want to listen to radio on demand. And I just can't believe the BBC, with all of its skill, with all of the innovation within the organisation, they couldn't think of a way in which they could embrace the new technology, the new consumption, to further what's already there within its network.
So are you saying that the model that you've come up with in Alfred was because the BBC had another place in the marketplace?
It was primarily because we don't have a BBC local radio station that covers us on FM in our part of Dorset. We can't get the BBC Radio Solent in the north of the county. But also people are consuming radio differently, and you look at the argument, we started off doing podcast and doing a local online news service, and the BBC offer with the local news covers Hampshire, Dorset and the Isle of Wight. We don't get any stories from our area. Perhaps week after week you don't find any Shaftesbury stories. So we try to find a way to get that information out there, but also be more now. People won't necessarily listen to a radio station all day. There's a lot of choice with all of the stations like Boom that will serve a certain demographic. So we tried to look at what our strength was, and that was local. And without having to wade through a load of different music that people wouldn't necessarily like, we thought, if we just do what people want in our town, essential local information, and let them go wherever they want for music and everything else, we'll provide a radio station that's effectively a loop of an hour-long daily podcast. And we did consider whether we're going to bother with FM at all, to be honest, because we were washing our face financially with the daily podcast, doing an hour a day, 365 days a year, and getting good listenership. The FM has been useful in that people who can't consume online have been able to listen to it. But our primary focus is a town of 9,000 people. We don't cover anything more than 5 miles away from the town centre. And it's all relevant to people in that patch. And I think the BBC's missed a trick because they could look at the way the transmitters are orientated and not go by the 1967 model. Look at how people listen to DAB now, geographic targeting. Just do it differently. And I think that's what really serves people.
Okay, well, thanks for that. Interesting response to the idea of people are consuming media differently. Mitty, again, there's this idea with Devonstream, which actually came out, I understand, from the lockdowns. And well, why don't you tell the story yourself about why it was created and what it achieves?
So Devonstream was founded by John, Stuart and Josie just out of lockdown because people and they themselves were creating audible art, be it music, podcasts, even poetry. People were making art and there wasn't always a home for it. Lots of commercial radio stations aren't going to play a local band song. Not everyone's going to get a chance to be heard in that way. And so they wanted to be that home for everything. As long as it relates to Devon, it has a place on Devonstream. And it's also a good place to archive, pieces of artwork that have, had their life, had their run. And so it functions more as a running playlist with about 480 items and also a curated, presented show by myself.
So you don't need a manager or anything, it just sort of looks after itself. And I think that is innovative. And how do you just carry out the quality assurances that, people are putting up appropriate stuff that fits within your brief? How do you
So it's all humanly moderated. We do, we ourselves assess.
We still need humans eventually, don't we? Yeah, thank God.
But we wanted to have a place for things that wouldn't necessarily make the charts and make local bands get a chance to say, my song was played on the radio, you can listen here, and people writing poems, recording stories, actors. I feel like we maybe have lost that going forward with such large stations. It feels like this is a real community place.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody coming into the industry, I mean, what do you feel the point of local radio is? And of course, you're also working down at X, aren't you?
Yes, I also do some things behind the scenes for Radio X, EXE, not the big X. I'm so confused. I think for me the biggest thing is connection. There's so many stories, so many people who just feel like there's someone to talk to, someone to listen to, and it would be such a shame for them to lose that. We have loyal listeners at both places, and it's really, really special, actually, to hear people's stories about how just you can be in their lives in such small ways as you hear them every day on the school run. I remember when I was younger, I'd always hear the same presenter on the school run, and it's so special, and it would be such a shame to lose that local connection, to know that they're just another person, they're just down the road, and you can hear them, and you can hear stories about what's going on around you, and who's near you.
But do you sense, I'm cut into you, but do you sense that it is threatened, that the whole of the local radio sector is threatened?
I think things are changing, and as someone just coming into the industry, it's scary because these sort of, there used to be a good sort of talent pipeline going upwards, and I worry that there won't. I know I've been very fortunate with my opportunities, in local radio. But if we lose those opportunities, then in 20 years' time, who will be the local presenters? That's what I'm worried about.
So fast-shifting landscape, there is risks and threats, but also I think we can establish opportunity as well. Keri, in what you're doing, Chris, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but Keri, what you're doing, what do you see the point of local radio as being?
Well, it depends on your area. I mean, you can't say, I think, in terms of what we're doing with community radio, you can have a broad brushstroke way of dealing with what the locality needs. Every town is different, and that's really important. So, I mean, Devonstream I listen to a lot, and it gives a sense of Devon. We reflect what happens in our town, and every town and community should do that. Within each community, there's probably an essence of information and providing a connection. What we do is primarily offering a news service because nobody else is doing it. And I was conscious of the fact when I started the podcast, things were happening in our town. They weren't getting reported. There was good news, great things happening. And that's why we started doing a daily podcast on the day that the lockdown started, continued that through, went to FM station, and the model is basically essential news and information. Some of it is very twee, cat stuck up a tree stuff, but we're a tiny town of 9,000 people, so you're going to get that. But we're really precise in that we won't cover anything 5 miles away in the next nearest town, because I'd rather have a lot of people listening to the station and not water down our content. So there's a sense of, you might do a story on a topic, somebody may not necessarily be interested in what you're talking about. There's a dark arts festival in Shaftesbury today, which is all about occult and paranormal-based art. Now, that's not for a lot of people, but because it's in our town and it's at the football club, I suspect people will be interested just because of the locality. So every area I suggest needs to do that. I think as we're talking to the future of radio, the companionship element is always going to be important, but I think we're probably going to go more to the big brands like Boom, where people can listen all day. And you've seen from their stunning average hours that people will do that because of the sense of connectivity with the presenter. And I think there's more space for small, hyper-local community stations to provide what the newspapers are no longer doing anymore because they're all clickbait. What's not happening with BBC Local Radio, what's not happening with BBC Online, is for us to seize the opportunity and provide voices for our individual communities, and that's the future of it as I view it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting idea that in the marketplace, people obviously listen to 2 or 3 maybe radio offerings, and you get something from a national radio station to satisfy your listening needs, and then you've got those locally trusted voices and those local stories. Chris, BBC Local Radio has sort of traditionally prioritised news reporting, sports and that kind of thing. Whilst perhaps you could take the opportunity of also articulating how much for each station will be local going forward, but where do you see those priorities in the future?
I think they're incredibly important. If you look at the plans we've announced, breakfast and mid-morning absolutely stay local, and that's where the majority of our news content has always been. Mid-morning, if I take Mike Sweeney at Radio Manchester, and the work that he's done with Andy Burnham there in terms of holding local politicians to account, that's incredibly important. It's also one of the reasons why on each of our local radio stations we have a local political reporter, because you mentioned, Keri, there the fact that local newspapers have moved away, absolutely, and I think that what local radio can do is in many areas plug that democratic deficit, and it also does that, and this is BBC Local, through the Local Democracy Reporter scheme as well, which is another really important initiative in terms of holding local councillors to account. So I think news, absolutely really important. And sport, you're in Leicester today, When You're Smiling, which is produced as a podcast as well as being a radio programme, is one of the most popular football podcasts on Sounds, likewise with the Daily Rams podcast produced by Radio Derby. And if I take something like the Leeds podcast, Don't Go to Bed Just Yet, when they did their visualised transfer window programme, yes, it was very popular on the radio, but those clips on social were shared around about 6.7 million times, bringing it to new audiences. So the partisanship in sport will be important. And just to pick up on your point, Mitty, about, local radio, being, if you like, that front door into the BBC. I do think the development of talent will still be an important part of what BBC local radio can offer, not exclusively, because there are lots of other places where people can now learn their craft. But, you know, if I take Somerset, Charlie Taylor, who actually came from community radio, he's now sitting there on Breakfast. Rima, who came through the New Voices scheme, she's on Breakfast at Radio Leeds, and is well known for the piece she did last year with Liz Truss. So for me, politics, sport, really important, and that sense of community through Make a Difference. And to some extent, I suppose what we're doing in BBC local radio is we've been looking at what are the things that we can deliver that perhaps other parts of the market aren't going to be as interested in. And I did hear one of the questions that was put to David earlier on about the relationship BBC local radio should have with community radio. Now, we've always had a memorandum of understanding, but I think that as we enter this new world, that's something that we need to actively revisit, and how we can work more in partnership together, because clearly there are really innovative things that you're doing, and you know we should be partnering that. That's not the BBC doing a takeover, it's being a good partner. That's really important for me.
As somebody who ran a radio station for 13 years, which worked in very close collaboration with the BBC, I always saw the value of that relationship as the regionally local working with the hyper-local. We were doing all the local sports fixtures. BBC Bristol and Somerset were doing the ones for the county areas. And this is something I think we will try and return to in this conversation. I will give us all an opportunity to say what we think the future of local radio is, but we are here with an audience, and I think we should open it up for questions. So no speeches, please, no speeches. Not looking at anyone in particular, but no speeches. Let's have a question. It looks like Kevin is going to be our first questioner.
No, it's on now. I want to thank David for his speech. I agree with absolutely everything he said, but nobody asked him the question, how can we change things and how can we implement that? Anyway, Chris, I would like to know from a licence payer's point of view, not a community radio station, I have to thank you for networking your services, because us as a sector are actually gaining loads of listeners that are quite angry that your local content's not there for 12 hours a day now. So that's a thank you to you. But as a licence payer, we're paying for a service that is supposed to be local radio, and it's now 8 hours a day, not 24 in most areas, and I'm listening to stuff from other areas, so why should I pay you?
Because I think, you know, it's not just about what you get from BBC local radio. The licence fee actually funds much more than that. And what we're trying to do, as I said, is we're trying to make sure that you get local content on a variety of different platforms. So if you go to Sounds, the Sounds rail is there. We will also have podcasts from those areas telling stories that are directly relevant to you. And also, I mean, if I take something like the Stephanie Slater podcast that was made by Andy Whitaker from Radio Nottingham, you know, what was great about that podcast was, one, it put a spotlight on a story. He was able to tell that story, I believe, in a way that no other BBC journalist could, because of his connections with the victims in that area, and also with the police in that area. And it also had so many issues that are still relevant today. And it was ironic and really very sad. The time that podcast was published was also at the same time the Sarah Everard tragedy happened. So I think what you get from the BBC is not just local radio, it's lots of other things as well. Now, there's more that we need to do, I think, to ensure that you're getting the service you want and ensure that you're getting the local sport you need, the news side of the things you need. And the other thing I should say, and I think we said this right at the start, you know, the creative process is an iterative one. You're constantly looking at what you're doing and have you got it right? And this is a large-scale change programme we're introducing across the whole of BBC Local. Of course, we won't get everything right first time round, and we will revisit and we will tweak things as we go along. But this is not about trying to cut money from BBC Local. This is trying to put money into digital services as well, because we know audiences are going there and they want to see local stories reflected back to them.
Okay, thank you for that. And as we are looking at the future, it's not only the change that's taking place in the traditional commercial sectors or indeed BBC sectors. Innovation, technical change, these are also driving the future of local radio. And I'd be interested to hear, we're going to come to you in a second for the next question, but if anyone has any particular thoughts about the models that we've heard over on the left stage here as informing how we might develop the community-orientated sector, I'd be very much interested in hearing from you. We have a question over there, yes?
Yes, my name's Steve. I'm from Ferndale Community Radio in Plymouth. And I got a question first for Chris. For my sins earlier, I was a member of the Radio Devon advisory panel where we met. We was out in our different areas, so Plymouth had one, and different cities and towns around Devon had them. And we would go out and we would meet all the listeners that could be at regular Radio Devon. What do you think? Any complaints, things like that. And we would meet with the editor once a month in a meeting, and there was a connection between the local area and the BBC. Well, in their hindsight, they decided that they were going to do away with the advisory panels, I think because they were working. That's my own personal view. But the point is, they did away with them, and they brought in a version where we want you to be an advisor, but we'll pick the subject that we want you to talk about. Yeah, the question is, why? Why do you think the BBC has lost its connection to local communities by doing away with these advisory panels?
Well, I wasn't around working BBC Local when that decision was taken, so I don't know the full background to it. Actually, I know that stations like Radio Merseyside, they still have a listener panel, and Kathy Krieg, who runs that listener panel, is in regular contact with me. I think, there are lots of different ways in which we connect with audiences. I think we do that through Make a Difference, and we get a lot of feedback there. We also now do a lot of virtual in-person sessions, and I was at one the other week, which was looking at WM, and I'm attending one next week, which is looking at Solent. But you're right, as we go through these changes, I think we do need to look at ways in which we can gather feedback from people like yourself. And if I have one plea that I would say at the end of today, if you've got questions about BBC Local, don't put it on X, write to me, and I'll happily engage in a conversation with you.
Can we get that contact detail for the audience here, Chris?
Yeah, I'm chris.burns@bbc.co.uk.
Okay, right. Sadly, this is going to prove to be only the start of the debate. We do have just time. I believe we'll try and stretch it to 2, but you ask your question.
Yes. So this is for Keri and Mitty. I just wanted to say, love the innovation of what you guys are doing. Obviously, things are evolving and looking to, the content being a bit more niche. So in terms of your licensing and things like that for local community radio, how do you plan to navigate the balance between, obviously, community guidelines, Ofcom, but still serving the right, content to the demographic you're after?
So at Devonstream, we are purely online currently. That's not to say we wouldn't go to DAB or FM if it's sort of opportunity presented itself. But we choose to adhere to Ofcom guidelines despite the fact that we don't have to because it's online. Mainly because listeners can sort of they can know what to expect and they can expect a level of consistency across what they're hearing wherever they choose to listen. And that's something I'm quite happy to do, is to adhere to those guidelines, yeah.
We have a special form of regulation. We're a small town. I or members of my team are out and about every single day. They know where I live. So if I say something vile, I'll get a brick through my window. In terms of, before we were online, before we were on air, we were following basically Ofcom principles. And it's effectively be nice and try not to get sued, isn't it? I mean, that's the basis of it. That said, I agree wholeheartedly with what David said earlier, because I think Ofcom has really got it in for community radio at the moment, and that Ribble FM farce was beyond the pale. You know, there's so much bloody work people have to do keeping the community radio station on air, and you don't need all these lengthy legalese responses that take you hours to wade through when somebody's just been vexatious, as is often the case. So I think there's time for a new regulator that actually looks at what it's like to run an operation with volunteers and what the challenges of community radio are, and not deal with broadband, or not deal with the BBC, as the case may be, you know, deal with a million other things. There needs to be some special consideration for the unique job people in this room are doing.
Quick question on the back of this. How important is licensing going forward?
Licensing or FM licensing?
Or just licensing local radio?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'd like people like Rob Pisani, who's in the room, to have a license for Rutland. It's a crime he hasn't. I think it's case by case again, Dom, to be honest. I mean, it's useful. We're finding people listen to us on FM now, as I said, who didn't sample the online version of Alfred. Although we get 1,000 listeners a day to the online in a town of 9,000 people, so we're happy with that. But people also find it easier. People who do consume us as podcasts sometimes find it easier rather than faff around with a podcast, just go in the car and know it's going to be on. So that obviously is a licensed stream, a broadcast. I think Ofcom's not going to have anything left to license pretty soon. I know senior people in the commercial radio sector who think local commercial radio's got 5 years left.
Yeah, so, that's it, yeah. So interesting. There's calls for reappraisal of how we're regulated, possible doubt in many models of the need for licensing. I think you've made a good point, Mitty, that you voluntarily sort of go into the restrictions around licensing because it is a quality assurance. We're going to do one more question. I'm going to come to each of you for a quick summing up. The person with the green jacket had her hand up first. Thank you.
Hi, I work for Fiesta FM down in Southampton. I host a little ukulele radio show, which is a bit niche, it's a bit out there, and I know there's lots of people that have probably got niche kind of shows that don't fit in with everything. I'm just wondering what kind of opportunities we could create for young people coming through, how they can move forward in their career and maybe one day get a job working for the BBC. I think there's not enough of that out there, and if any funding could go into that.
Yeah, fantastic, because this is about the future, so the future of emerging creative talent. Chris Burns, do you want to just pick up on that? I mean, what opportunities are there, and how are you helping the new generation come in?
Well, clearly we're doing it through things like introducing, but I know introducing may not fit for everybody. I think that's very often down to the individual radio station. I remember Stoke a few years ago, they had a great initiative in the evening where they had something called the mixtape. And the mixtape was literally just that. It could be anything.
I'm going to have to ask you to be brief, Chris. I do apologise.
It very often featured people from community radio. But you could literally, it could be ukulele, it could be rap, it could be somebody reading a poem. And I think the more of that we can do across local, the better.
Great. Love the idea of bringing ukulele and rap together. Splendid. Opportunities for emerging creative talent at Alfred?
Well, I mean, if you live in the town, you can come on it. It's simple as that.
Well, that's nice. Nice answer. Nice short answer. That is what community radio is. That is what I think local radio is, certainly on its hyper-local. Well, you're a young person, so certainly from where I'm sitting, and you've obviously chosen to come into this. You've heard from Chris that there are continuing to be opportunities, and what is happening in the BBC on a personal level, being in that environment, has got to be good for your career and building your professional confidence. And do you see a future for yourself going into this industry or furthering?
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like there is still some accessibility problems, but that's, I think, across all radio. I think it's just something that people don't know how they can get their foot in the door. But I've had to sort of put myself out there continually to get the opportunities I've had with Devonstream and with Radio X, and I would say the same for every job. You've got to keep putting yourself out there, and I've been very fortunate, but it would be amazing to see more opportunities, to see it more accessible, to see it open up to kids. So I actually run a club called Young Broadcasters to help kids make podcasts, and that's that kind of thing, I think, is the way forward to get people from all ages, as young as 10-year-olds, just recording their own voice, listening to the radio if they don't already discovering what's out there.
And the value of all the competencies and employabilities and good well-being that come with that, and those are those wider impacts we're concerned about at Sound Vision. And as we could pick up the young people, of course, those who want to go into the professional audio and radio industry, the Radio Academy is also there to pick up that, as well as the support of places like the Community Media Association. Now, we are very, very close to our session, the last music session. Lunch is beckoning shortly. I'm being given a hurry up, but I'm not going to leave the stage until I've asked all three of you to give a very, very brief, if you don't mind, summary of how the future of local radio is for you. Keri, I'm looking at you first.
Right, well, it's a big question, isn't it? I mean, just...
Big question, short answer.
Think of what is important to your community. Everything you do, think about your listener. Try and get rid of all the anoraks in your organisation. Don't replicate what's been there before. Challenge it. Don't do Late Night Love. Don't do Top 10 at 10. Don't have any jingles that use the word smooth sailing or have Sonovox. Make it about now. Make it about the listeners and what they want, and construct something that actually super serves your community, and like a stick of rock has got the name of your town going all the way through it.
Chris Burns, the future of local radio. That's the thing.
I agree with all of that Keri said. I think the future is bright. And I think our future rests on the innovative talents of everybody in the room today and everybody across the sector. We have to keep adapting to audience changes, but we also have to be proud of being local.
Thank you for that. Mitty, last word with you.
I'm optimistic. I think doors are opening, and the BBC might even be creating a new gap in the market for people like me to keep developing, and radio is growing and it's getting better and better, and I can't wait to see what the future holds.
Thank you very much. If we allow ourselves to change our perceptions of what local radio is, you will hover above and see an absolutely thriving landscape with a great with a great future. And that is my pleasure to witness as I travel around the country and visit local radio stations in the UK. This has been brief, but it's been, I think, very informative. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to Keri Jones. Thank you to Mitty James. And thank you to Chris Burns. Thank you.